The first time Eliza May Dawson had the idea, she was standing in the half-frozen mud beneath their raised cabin, trying to retrieve a rolling can of lard that had escaped through a gap in the floorboards. It was February 1847, and the Montana Territory winter had already claimed two of their neighbors, one to pneumonia, one to simple starvation, when his root cellar froze solid. Eliza had been widowed for 8 months, left with a 5-year-old daughter, a raised floor cabin her husband had built too high off the ground, and a stubbornness that frontier life both required and rewarded. She ducked into the crawl space with a lantern, cursing the 18-inch gap between earth and floor that James had insisted on. "Good drainage," he'd said. "Keeps the rot out." What it also did was create a cold, useless void that trapped every winter wind blowing across the Montana plains. But standing there, lantern in hand, lard can retrieved and covered in half-frozen mud, she'd felt something unexpected. Warmth. Not much, but compared to the brutal cold outside, 15 degrees with a wind that cut like a knife, the space beneath the cabin was noticeably warmer. She held still, trying to understand what she was feeling. Heat from the cookstove above was seeping down through the floorboards. The earth below, insulated by the snow piled around the foundation, was releasing its stored autumn warmth. Even the log walls that extended down to ground level helped trap the heat. Eliza May stood very still, her breath forming small clouds in the lantern light, an idea forming that was either brilliant or mad. What if this wasn't wasted space? What if it could be a greenhouse? The thought was so audacious it made her laugh. A short, sharp sound in the enclosed space. A greenhouse. In winter. In Montana. Built by a widow with barely enough money for spring seed, but the more she thought about it, the more the physics made sense. Heat rises, yes, but it also spreads. Their cookstove burned hot all winter, had to, for cooking and warmth. That heat warmed the cabin floor. Some of it was escaping down here, wasted. If she could trap it, contain it, maybe even enhance it with glass to capture sunlight. She stood there for 10 more minutes, cold forgotten, mind racing through possibilities. She spent 2 weeks thinking it through before she told anyone, even Grace. Eliza had learned that announcing half-formed plans invited either pity or mockery, and she could afford neither. Instead, she observed, measured, and planned. The cabin sat on 12 massive stone piers, each one sunk 3 feet into the ground and rising 18 inches above grade. James had built it that way, after seeing too many frontier cabins rot from ground contact. The floor joists were rough-hewn pine, 14 inches deep, spanning 8 feet between piers. Above that, inch-thick pine planking formed the actual floor, with gaps between boards for drainage. Those gaps, Eliza realized, were perfect for heat transfer. The space beneath was roughly 20 feet by 16 feet, enclosed on 3 sides by the cabin's log walls extending down to ground level. The front was open, facing south. In summer, this allowed airflow. In winter, it created a wind tunnel of misery. But if she closed that front opening with glass, glass was the problem. Glass was expensive, fragile, and nearly impossible to transport across the frontier without breakage. The nearest real town was a 3-day wagon ride, and the nearest source of window glass was probably St. Louis, a month away in good weather. Eliza needed a different solution. She found it in the Sears and Roebuck catalog that Mrs. Peterson had lent her, its pages dog-eared and stained from frontier use. There, between advertisements for cast-iron stoves and patent medicines, she found what she needed: greenhouse glass cold frames. The description was simple. Wooden frames 3 feet by 6 feet, with glazed sash tops, hinged for ventilation, protects tender plants from frost. Essential for the progressive farmer. $4.50 each. They were designed to sit on the ground, creating miniature greenhouses for starting seeds. But Eliza saw them differently. If she ordered 6 of these frames and installed them vertically as windows along the south-facing opening of her crawl space, she'd have a glass wall. The hinged tops could open for ventilation. The wooden frames would be easier to install than loose panes of glass. It would cost $27, nearly everything she had left from selling James's tools. Grace found her mother doing arithmetic by candlelight that night, the catalog open, numbers scratched on slate. "Mama, what are you figuring?" Eliza looked at her daughter, small for 5, serious beyond her years, wearing a dress let out twice and still too short. Grace deserved better than salt pork and cornmeal every day. She deserved vegetables, greens, something fresh in the dead of winter. "I'm figuring how to grow food in February," Eliza said. Grace's eyes widened. "Magic?" "Engineering," Eliza corrected. Then, more gently, "Come here, let me show you something." She took Grace's hand and led her to the corner where the floorboards had the widest gaps. She lit a candle and held it near the gap. "Watch the flame." The candle flame bent downward, pulled by the draft of warm air sinking through the floor. "Heat rises," Eliza explained, "but it also spreads. The heat from our stove warms the floor. That warmth sinks down into the space below. Right now, it just escapes into the cold. But if we trapped it, if we made that space into a room with glass walls, we could keep it warm enough to grow things. Vegetables, herbs, maybe even flowers." Grace was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then, "Will it work?" Eliza May Dawson, who'd been asking herself the same question for 2 weeks, looked at her daughter and said the only true thing she knew. "I'm going to find out." The order took 6 weeks to arrive, coming up the Missouri River by steamboat and then overland by freight wagon. When the wagon driver unloaded 6 wooden crates stamped "fragile glass," half the trading post gathered to watch. "Building a greenhouse, Mrs. Dawson?" asked Tom Morrison, the post manager, not unkindly. "Something like that," Eliza said, inspecting the crates for damage. "Lot of money for a maybe," observed Frank Hutchins, who'd lost his own wife to childbirth the previous spring and had opinions about how widows should spend their resources. Eliza didn't respond. She'd learned that explaining yourself to skeptics was a waste of breath. She paid the freight charges, hired Morrison's eldest son to help load the crates into her wagon, and drove home. Grace was waiting on the porch, practically vibrating with excitement. "Are they here? Did they break?" "They're here," Eliza confirmed, "and we'll know soon if they broke." They opened the first crate together, prying nails carefully to preserve the wood. Inside, nested in straw, was a beautiful thing, a wooden frame 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, made from pine and painted white. The top third was a glazed sash, 12 panes of glass, each one intact, set in a hinged frame that opened and closed smoothly on brass hinges. Grace reached out one careful finger to touch the glass. "It's so smooth." "It is," Eliza agreed. "And expensive. We'll be very careful with it." They spent the rest of the day unpacking all 6 frames. By some miracle of freight handling or God's grace, only 1 pane was cracked, and even that was a clean break that could be puttied and still be functional. That night, after Grace was asleep, Eliza sat at the table and drew plans. She wasn't an engineer, but James had taught her to think through a project before starting. Measure twice, cut once. Plan for failure. Build for strength. The south-facing opening beneath the cabin was roughly 16 feet wide and 18 inches tall, from ground level to the bottom of the floor joists. Her 6 cold frames, stood on end, would be too tall. Each frame was 6 feet long, and the opening was only 18 inches high. She'd have to modify them, cut them down, install them horizontally in 2 rows, 3 frames on the bottom row, 3 on top, creating a glass wall 6 feet tall and 18 feet wide. The math worked. The question was whether she could do the carpentry. She started the next morning after Grace had eaten breakfast. The work required precision she wasn't sure she possessed, but necessity was an excellent teacher. First, she needed to prepare the opening itself. The space between the ground and the floor joists was currently just open air. She needed to frame it properly, create a proper wall structure to mount the glass frames against. Eliza cut pine 2x4s to length using James's crosscut saw, a tool she'd learned to sharpen herself over the long winter. She created vertical studs every 3 feet along the south-facing opening, measuring carefully with a knotted string she'd marked at 12-inch intervals. Each stud needed to be exactly plumb, or the whole structure would twist. She sunk the bottom of each stud 6 inches into the earth, tamping the soil tight with a wooden mallet. The tops she nailed to the underside of the floor joists with hand-forged nails. Expensive, but necessary. Each nail represented a calculation. Would it hold? Could she afford it? What happened if she guessed wrong? Then she added horizontal cross pieces at 2 heights, one at 6 inches from the ground, one at 12 inches, creating a grid framework that would distribute the weight of the glass and resist wind pressure. James had taught her this. Any structure needs both vertical and horizontal support. Vertical carries weight. Horizontal resists sideways force. Grace helped, handing her nails one at a time from an old tobacco tin, holding boards steady when Eliza needed both hands for the saw, learning without being explicitly taught. Why are we making boxes, Mama? Because glass needs something strong to sit against, Eliza explained, pausing to wipe sawdust from her forehead. If we just hung it in the air, the wind would break it. But if we give it a strong frame, it can survive. The frame takes the stress. The glass just has to be glass. Like how my doll needs me to hold her? Eliza smiled. Exactly like that. The work took 3 days of steady labor. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her shoulders ached from the unfamiliar angles of overhead work. But by the end, Eliza had created a proper wall frame with 6 rectangular openings, each sized exactly for her cold frame windows. The structure was solid, square-checked with a string level, and ready. She'd also learned something about herself. She could do this. She could measure, cut, build. The knowledge felt like power. Now came the delicate part, installing the glass. She'd modified her approach after the first day's work. Instead of cutting down the cold frames, which might weaken them, she would install them at an angle, tilted to catch maximum sunlight. The bottom frames would sit nearly horizontal, angled up at 30 degrees. The top frames would be more vertical, creating a sloped glass wall that followed the angle of winter sun. It was unconventional, but it made sense. She was building something no catalog had anticipated. The first frame went up on a Saturday. Eliza lifted it carefully, Grace guiding from below, and secured it to the frame with screws instead of nails. Screws could be adjusted if she'd miscalculated. The frame fit. The glass caught the morning light and threw it back in brilliant sheets. Grace clapped. "It's beautiful, Mama." It was. It was also functional. Eliza immediately noticed the difference. With even one frame in place, the wind was blocked. The space felt calmer. By the end of the week, all 6 frames were mounted. The south-facing opening was now a wall of glass, angled and brilliant. The hinged sash tops could still open for ventilation, but for now, Eliza kept them closed. She'd created a greenhouse. Under her house, in Montana, in winter. Now she needed to see if it would actually work. The first test came that night. Eliza cooked dinner as usual. Salt pork, beans, cornbread, keeping the cook stove hot. After Grace was asleep, she took a lantern and thermometer and climbed down into the underhouse space. The thermometer read 48 degrees. Outside, it was 19 degrees and falling. Inside the cabin, near the stove, it was 65. And here, in this in-between space, sheltered by glass and warmed by the floor above, it was 48 degrees. Above freezing. Barely. But above. Eliza May Dawson allowed herself a moment of fierce satisfaction. The principle worked. Heat from the stove was sinking through the floorboards. The glass was trapping it. The earth below was contributing its stored warmth. It wasn't warm enough yet, not for most vegetables. But it was a start. Over the next week, she made improvements. She banked earth against the outside of the glass frames, creating an insulating berm that reduced heat loss through the base. She sealed gaps between the frames with oakum, the same tarred hemp fibers used to caulk ships available at the trading post. She added thermal mass. This was a trick she'd read about in an agricultural journal. Dark-colored materials absorb heat during the day and release it at night. She collected river stones, painted them black with lamp black mixed with linseed oil, and arranged them in barrels beneath the glass. During the day, sunlight would warm them. At night, they'd radiate heat back. The temperature crept up. 50 degrees, 52, 55. Finally, when the thermometer held steady at 58 degrees for 3 consecutive nights, Eliza decided it was time. "Grace," she said one morning, "today we're going to plant a garden." The soil itself was a challenge. She couldn't dig frozen ground, and the earth beneath the house, while unfrozen, was hardpan, compressed and lifeless from years of being trampled and having water drip through the floorboards above. She needed to create garden beds from scratch. She built raised beds from scrap lumber James had stockpiled. Simple boxes, 2 feet wide and 6 feet long, arranged in rows on either side of the central walkway she'd planned. Each box required careful construction. The sides had to be sturdy enough to hold soil weight, but she couldn't afford to waste wood. She cut the boards, drilled pilot holes to prevent splitting, and assembled them with the last of James's square-cut nails. She'd planned for this, ordering not just glass frames, but also seeds and something she'd never heard of before, reading that agricultural journal Mrs. Peterson had loaned her. Composted manure, dried and aged, suitable for hotbeds and forcing houses. It arrived in burlap sacks that smelled exactly as expected. Grace wrinkled her nose dramatically. "That's nasty, Mama." "That's fertility," Eliza corrected, though privately she agreed. "Plants love it. It's full of everything they need to grow. Nitrogen, phosphorus, organic matter, and it generates heat as it breaks down, which we need." She filled the raised beds with careful layers, a technique she'd read about in the journal. The bottom layer was 6 inches of the dried manure, which would slowly decompose and warm the soil from below. Next came prairie soil she'd collected in autumn and stored in barrels. Rich, dark loam from a creek bottom where native grasses had grown for centuries. She mixed this with more composted manure, creating a nutrient-rich growing medium. The final top layer was 2 inches of fine soil mixed with sand for drainage and easier seed germination. Each bed took an hour to fill. Grace helped scoop soil, tamping it gently with her small hands, asking questions constantly. Why does the manure make heat? Because tiny creatures you can't see eat it, and when they eat, they make warmth, like how you feel warm after eating supper. There are creatures in the dirt. Millions of them. There are helpers. The bed steamed faintly in the cool air when Eliza first watered them with warm water from the stove, the decomposing manure generating its own heat, just as the journal had promised. She watched with satisfaction as the steam rose. Biology and physics working together. Everything connected. Then came the planting. Eliza had chosen her seeds carefully, ordering varieties bred for cold frames and winter forcing. Tom Thumb lettuce, Laxton's marvel cabbage, early round spinach, and herbs, parsley, chives, wintertime. She also ordered carrot and radish seeds, quick-growing varieties that could tolerate cool soil. Grace helped, her small fingers surprisingly deft at spacing seeds. Not too deep, Eliza instructed. Lettuce seeds need light to sprout. Just press them into the soil and cover lightly. They worked together through the afternoon, planting row by row. By evening, 6 raised beds were planted, watered, and waiting. Now what? Grace asked. Now we wait, Eliza said, and hope. The seeds germinated in 8 days. Eliza had been checking twice daily, climbing down into the greenhouse each morning and evening with her lantern, worried about temperature, moisture, damping off, fungal diseases, seed-eating insects, every possible failure her reading had warned about. She'd kept a journal of temperatures, noting that the greenhouse held steady between 55 and 62 degrees, depending on the outside temperature and how much she used the cook stove. But on the 8th morning, February 28th by her careful calendar keeping, she climbed down with the lantern and found tiny green shoots emerging in the lettuce bed. Dozens of them, perfectly spaced in the rows she and Grace had planted. She called Grace down immediately, unable to contain her excitement. Look, carefully, right there. Grace peered at the soil, confused at first, seeing only dark earth. Then Eliza adjusted the lantern angle, and suddenly they were visible, tiny sprouts, pale green and impossibly fragile, pushing up through the dark earth like small miracles. Is that lettuce? That's lettuce, Eliza confirmed, and she heard the emotion in her own voice, relief and triumph, and the joy of a gamble that had paid off. We're growing food, in February, in Montana, under the house. Grace reached out one small finger, stopping just before touching. Can I touch it? Very gently. The stem is delicate. Grace touched the tiny plant with one fingertip, her expression solemn. It's soft. It is, and in a few weeks, if we take care of it, it'll be big enough to eat. More sprouted over the next few days. The spinach came up in neat, uniform rows. Eliza had been more careful with spacing after the lettuce. The radishes popped up fast, their cotyledons unfurling like tiny hands reaching for the filtered sunlight. The carrots were slower, taking 12 days, but eventually appeared as delicate, ferny shoots. The cabbage seeds germinated within 10 days, producing sturdy seedlings that Eliza knew she'd need to thin later. She thinned the lettuce on day 14, carefully pulling every other seedling to give the remaining plants room to grow. It felt wasteful until Grace pointed out they could eat the thinnings. They did. Tiny lettuce plants, roots and all, washed and added to their dinner. They were small, but they were fresh and green and alive, and they tasted like hope. Word got around. News on the frontier traveled through a combination of gossip, trading post visits, and the arrival of freight wagons. By March, People knew that the Dawson widow had built some kind of contraption under her house and was supposedly growing vegetables in winter. Some thought it was a rumor. Others assumed she'd somehow preserved autumn vegetables and was lying about growing them fresh. Frank Hutchins openly said she was wasting resources on foolishness. Then Mrs. Peterson came to visit. She was the wife of the trading post manager, a practical woman in her 50s who'd survived 20 years on the frontier by being open to new ideas. She brought Grace a rag doll as a gift, hand-sewn with embroidered eyes and yarn hair, and asked politely if she could see this greenhouse everyone was talking about. Eliza showed her. Mrs. Peterson climbed down the stairs into the underhouse space, lantern in hand, and stopped dead. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a dark crawl space was now a thriving garden room. The glass frames glowed with filtered sunlight. The raised beds were lush with growth. Lettuce plants with dark green leaves, spinach thick and healthy, radish tops bright green, carrot fronds feathery and delicate, cabbage seedlings sturdy, herbs fragrant in the warm, humid air. 2 lanterns burned at the base of the stairs, creating golden light that mixed with daylight from the glass. The temperature was comfortable, perhaps 60 degrees. The air smelled like earth and growing things and well water. It smelled alive. Mrs. Peterson walked slowly along the central path, examining everything. She touched a lettuce leaf, testing its texture. She bent to smell the herbs. She examined how the glass frames were mounted. She touched the painted rocks, understanding their purpose. She felt a raised bed, sensing the warmth of composting manure below. Finally, she looked at Eliza with something like awe. "You built a greenhouse, under your house, with cold frames and mail order supplies." "Yes, ma'am." "How warm does it stay?" 55 to 62 degrees, depending on how cold it is outside and how much I use the cook stove. Warmer on sunny days. I keep records. She showed Mrs. Peterson her journal of daily temperature readings. "And it's the heat from your floor that keeps it warm?" "The floor heat is part of it. The sun through the glass. The earth below. The thermal mass." She gestured to the painted rocks. "Helps even out the temperature. The composting manure generates heat too. It all works together." Mrs. Peterson shook her head slowly. "My husband needs to see this. Half the trading post needs to see this. This could change how people winter here. Fresh vegetables in February. A way to extend the growing season by months." "It's just vegetables, Mrs. Peterson." "It's innovation. It's survival. It's proof that the frontier doesn't have to mean deprivation and scurvy for 6 months." She paused. "May I bring people to see this? You might have something important here." Eliza hesitated, then nodded. Good ideas were meant to be shared. "Yes, bring them." By April, the lettuce was ready to harvest. Eliza picked the outer leaves carefully, leaving the centers to continue growing. A cut-and-come-again method that would provide continuous harvest. The spinach was abundant, the radishes crisp and peppery. She made the first salad in 4 months. Grace stared at the bowl of fresh greens as if it were magic. "Can I eat it?" "That's the whole point," Eliza said, smiling. They ate together, sitting at their rough-hewn table, fresh lettuce and radishes dressed with a little vinegar and salt. It was simple. It was profound. Grace chewed thoughtfully, then looked up. "This tastes like summer." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. Her daughter had been so pale all winter, living on preserved foods and salt meat. Already, after a week of fresh vegetables, there was color in her cheeks. "It does, doesn't it?" Mrs. Peterson brought her husband the next week. Then they brought the Morrison family. Then Frank Hutchins came. skeptical and argumentative, and left quiet and thoughtful. By May, when the outdoor ground finally thawed enough to plant a regular garden, Eliza May Dawson had received 11 requests for help building similar greenhouses. She also received an offer from the Sears and Roebuck regional agent to write up her design for their catalog, with a small payment for the rights to publish it. She said yes to both. The catalog listing appeared in the fall 1848 edition, under Innovative Agricultural Solutions for the Progressive Homesteader. It included detailed measurements, a list of required materials, and Eliza's careful notes on temperature management and ventilation. The payment, $15, was more money than she'd seen in one sum since James died. More importantly, the design reached people she'd never meet, in territories she'd never see, helping families she'd never know survive winters that might otherwise have broken them. The story might have ended there, a frontier innovation, a clever woman's solution to winter scarcity, a small success that helped a few families survive. But what Eliza May had created was more significant than she'd realized. The underhouse greenhouse solved multiple frontier problems simultaneously. It utilized wasted space. It required no additional heating beyond the normal household stove. It provided fresh food during the most dangerous months, and it could be built with materials available through mail-order catalogs. By the following year, Eliza had helped 7 families build their own versions. Each one was slightly different, adapted to their specific cabin design and needs. Some added more glass, some incorporated cisterns for warmed water storage. One family built theirs entirely below ground level, creating a true pit greenhouse with just the glass showing above grade. Eliza found herself becoming an unlikely expert. She charged nothing for advice, but accepted payment for actual construction help, a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. It was enough to supplement her income and provide a bit of security. Grace, meanwhile, had discovered she had a gift for plants. She took over much of the greenhouse management, learning to read the subtle signs of stress or disease, to manage ventilation, to time plantings for continuous harvest. On a winter evening in December 1848, nearly 2 years after Eliza had first stood in the mud beneath her cabin with a wild idea, she sat on the stairs leading down into the greenhouse. Grace sat beside her, holding the rag doll Mrs. Peterson had given her, now worn and well-loved. The lanterns glowed warmly. The plants thrived in their neat beds. Outside, through the open door at the top of the stairs, snow fell steadily, but here beneath the floor, it was warm and green and alive. "Mama," Grace said quietly. "Yes, sweetheart." "Do you miss Papa?" It was a question Grace asked sometimes, always seriously, always when something made her think of James. "Every day," Eliza said honestly. "But I think he'd be proud of this. He built a cabin to keep us safe. We built a garden to keep us fed. We're both doing what needs doing." Grace nodded, satisfied with this answer. She leaned against her mother, and they sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the evidence of ingenuity, persistence, and the simple human refusal to surrender to circumstance. The greenhouse beneath the floor had started as a desperate idea in a difficult winter. It had become something more, proof that even in the harshest conditions, even with limited resources, even when others said it couldn't be done, a determined mind could find a way forward. Eliza May Dawson hadn't just built a greenhouse. She'd built a future, one careful seed at a time. Outside, winter raged. Inside, beneath the floor, the seeds kept growing,